If you were taught to be a dutiful daughter all your life, to put the need of your family above your own, and suddenly you indulge in activities that are just for yourself. Maybe it's as simple as relaxing on the couch or reading a romance novel to yourself or having a girls' night out. You feel guilt because it's wrong by your own standard. Hi, my name is Michelle, and this is my Reading Like a Writer series. In this video, we're going to talk about House of Sticks by Ly Tran, a memoir she wrote about her life and her experience growing up in New York as an immigrant. She arrived in America when she was 3 years old with her three brothers and her parents. Her dad was a prisoner of war, and he spent a decade in Cai Tao, which was a re-education camp for soldiers who served the Southern Vietnamese Army during the war. I don't want to spend too much time explaining what that is, so if you're curious about it and want to learn more about it, go look it up on Google. This memoir was very moving, and since my parents were also refugees, it actually helped me understand the landscape of what they were coming from because it was written in English, whereas my parents weren't able to articulate their experience to me in a way that I could deeply understand. Though my dad was not a prisoner of war himself, my grandpa was actually in one of these re education camps for a decade as well. And I want to point out that this is not a summary of House of Sticks, and this is also not a review. This is just me talking about what resonated with me in this memoir and also highlighting some writing techniques that I've learned something from. So let's start off by talking about what resonated with me in this memoir. House of Sticks by Ly Tran was a visceral experience for me. There were just moments in this memoir where it felt like someone was literally punching me in the gut. I felt such deep sorrow for Tran as I was reading her story. Trigger warning for anyone who hasn't read it yet and is planning to read it that there are some heavy topics in this memoir that includes abuse, thoughts, ideation things, and depression. I also want to mention that I will be talking about the book as a whole. So if you haven't read the book yet, please pause and come back later. This is your spoiler alert. Without further ado, let's begin. What resonated with me most about this memoir was the guilt that Tran felt throughout her childhood and into her adulthood about circumstances that were utterly out of her control. This resonated with me so much because I feel like even though we grew up in different families, lived in different countries, and had somewhat different but same circumstances, I too felt the weight of guilt on my shoulders since I was very little and continue to feel that guilt as an adult. A lot of the guilt that I've been feeling throughout my entire life, in a way, was very similar to trans. Like, your parents sacrificed everything for you and you're amounting to nothing. And your parents are navigating a country where they don't understand the language. How could you abandon them? And in reading this memoir, I kept having this uncomfortable, unnamed feeling come to the surface. It wasn't like she went into detail about the physical abuse that she endured. That would make me cringe being immersed in her story and picturing that abuse in my mind. No, she doesn't write like that. It's not vivid depictions of abuse that made me cringe. And yet, through just normal descriptions of her feelings and objectively showing us her life, I kept having this deep, visceral reaction to certain parts of the book. Some even inducing tears, and at times I had to put the book down and take a deep breath. But what about this book was making me so uncomfortable? I didn't really know until I got further into the book because the feeling would seemingly come out of nowhere. One scene I remember having this episode is when Tran's dad visits the donut shop after work and asks for leftovers. Before this, he was bringing home donuts every week for his kids and telling his kids that his boss was giving him these box of donuts to bring home to his family. And one night, Tran and her mom walked to the bus stop to surprise her dad after work, and they witnessed him at the donut shop asking for the leftovers. She writes, "Do you have leftovers tonight?" my father asked loudly. "It's leftovers, you idiot," the manager said. opening the door and handing over the box of doughnuts. He was a stocky white man with a big nose and thinning black hair. Yes, my father said. Yes, lept opa. Thank you so much, okay? He bowed to the manager several times, grinning broadly. Yeah, get out of here, the manager said. This scene had me undone. I was huffing, tears rolling down my face, and I had to put the book down for a second. In my life, I have witnessed my parents struggling with the English language, with being treated like they were not as smart, not as capable, pretty much being treated like children. This scene broke my heart into a million pieces because it's so hard to watch someone that you love and respect being dismissed like a rat on the street. And of course, there was also that other piece, the pride that her dad had, that he didn't tell the family that he was going to the donut shop to ask for leftovers. That would make his treat feel pitiful. And instead, he wanted to feel like he was doing something for his family that he could be proud of. Because he didn't have much else to be proud of at this point. They were poor. He was a man, the man of the family, but he couldn't navigate the world with confidence because he was not in his home country. This was not his language. This was not his culture. Reading that and projecting some of my own life experiences onto Tran's story made this moment so. I don't want to speak on behalf of all immigrant kids out there, but I have a feeling that many immigrant kids would have experienced this in one form or another. As I continued reading, I was finally able to name the unnamed emotion. It was guilt. The guilt of the sacrifices your parents make and that you're aware of. The guilt that you are so much more privileged than they are. The guilt that you need to be a dutiful daughter. The guilt of abandoning your parents if you choose to pursue your own goals or stray off the path that they've laid out for you. In these pages, the feeling of guilt, both mine and Tran's, kept surfacing and slapping me in the face. And the thing is, Tran's dad was not perfect. He was abusive and irrational. Tran needed glasses from the third grade and he forbid her from getting them because he believed that it was a government conspiracy to make her more blind. Previously being a good student, not being able to see affected her grades dramatically. And it's not that she didn't care about school. She cared deeply about school. So this really affected her. She tried to ask him for the glasses a couple times, but he got very, very angry. And he didn't believe that she needed glasses. And in some instances, he even accused her of trying to be cool and be like the other kids. And that's the reason why she was asking for these glasses. Was he perhaps trying to hold on to the Vietnameseness of her and trying not to let her get sucked into this American culture and holding on to that Vietnamese part of their family? Or was he seriously just that paranoid about government because he came from a country where the government could not be trusted? Regardless, this abuse and neglect from Tran's dad left her feeling frustrated, helpless, and later depressed, which further debilitated her and created this negative cycle of self blame and helplessness. And despite this, she respected her dad and didn't dare defy him, even in her mind. And I don't have a doubt that her dad loved her, but he was dealing with his own demons. Does that make how he treated her right? No, but the love was definitely there. And it wasn't until she got older and her worldview started expanding through meeting different people, a lot of mentors, people who wanted to help her, that she finally started to come around and consider that maybe her dad was wrong. So after I finished the book, I got a little bit obsessed about this topic. So I looked up a resource on Google Scholar. The resource is about guilt, and I wanted to answer a very specific question. I'll leave the link to the resource in the description below if you're interested in reading it for yourself. It's pretty old, it's from the 80s, but it gave me what I needed to know, sort of. The article is called The Origin of Guilt by Carolyn, Zahn-Waxler, and Grazyna, Kochanska. They're both psychologists. I wanted to read up on what guilt is and how it's formed to kind of help me understand my own guilt, how it could be so similar to Tran's, even though our family dynamics and upbringing was kind of different. So, in this article, The Origin of Guilt by Zahn-Waxler and Kochanska, I wanted it to help me answer the question, where does guilt come from and how does it form? What is it exactly? And it's a little bit textbooky, so I paraphrase. At some point during the child's development, she begins to internalize cultural rules and expectations on how to think and act towards other people. Parents are the first to instill these rules, and then they become a part of the child's own standards and values. It's a process of internalizing stuff that you learn from your parents on how you should think and act towards others. As kids start to develop a conscience, guilt is an emotion that develops alongside of that. That conscience is sort of becoming, and how our conscience is the awareness of guilt. But guilt is not always bad. In fact, it is good to feel guilt because it indicates that a person has a conscience, that you would feel bad about something if you thought whatever you did wasn't right, preventing you from doing that bad thing again to avoid feeling guilty. But if things get wonky during the development of guilt and a conscience and all that, it can cause problems for people. I'm going to read something that comes right from the text of this textbook article. Disturbances in guilt have been linked with various forms of psychopathology and psychiatric disorders. This is from the American Psychiatric Association, 1980. It then goes to list some of those symptoms of those disturbances. But the one that caught my interest was this one. Excessive and inappropriate feelings of responsibility and self-blame are also linked with other emotional disorders such as depression. The intensity of guilt and associated cognitions of being pervasively unworthy, blameworthy, and responsible for the problems of others typically seem out of proportion in the depressed person. Not to say that disturbances of guilt will lead to things like depression, but it suggests that these excessive and inappropriate feelings of responsibility and self-blame, the intensity of guilt and blaming yourself for other people's problems is exaggerated in the depressed person. In Tran's memoir, she writes openly and honestly about her depression, how debilitating and frustrating it was. I'm not at all trying to make a diagnosis here saying that guilt was the root to her depression. No, I'm not doing that. I'm just trying to excavate and find more context to that feeling that I felt when I was reading her memoir. So, this is not like a research paper coming to conclusions. This is more of a reflective exercise, I would say, to kind of dive deep into how the book made me feel and why I had those feelings. Since I am writing a memoir, these are exercises that I do to help me understand myself better in order to be able to write myself better. And though I can relate to the guilt Tran was circling around in her memoir, I don't actually know what it's like to be depressed. And I'm so thankful that Tran was open and honest about her experience because it helps me understand the experience that someone might have when they are depressed. Chanel Miller in Know My Name also writes about a similar experience that she has as well. So, like I said, I went into this deep rabbit hole of this whole guilt thing, and my curiosity was not finished yet. I also wanted to know, where does guilt come from? So, from this same resource from Zahn-Waxler and Kochanska, they've laid out 3 theories of how guilt is formed. Again, it's super textbooky, so I paraphrase. The first one is that guilt is driven by negative forces within the self. It's when unacceptable impulses are turned inward and various defense mechanisms are put in place to prevent awareness of these bad impulses. And the guilt that comes with that often has an irrational, primitive, and distorted quality. The origins of guilt in this theory is linked to the child's early experiences. When feelings of hostility or sexuality or both towards the parents become repressed due to fear of punishment or fear of loss of parental love. In Tran's memoir, The Whole Situation with the Glasses, she writes, "Some part of me knew my father was wrong, but I hadn't yet learned to challenge his authority, not even in my mind. Pretending not to care about school gave me a way out. I could avoid admitting to myself and to others that my all knowing father was, in fact, wrong about my eyesight and wrong about glasses. And I could avoid the feeling of powerlessness that would come from such a realization. I walked on, armed with this false sense of strength, the sound of my shaky footsteps echoing against the walls of an empty hallway. The guilt she felt in defying her father, the repercussions that would have, made her turn inward and pretend like she didn't care about school. When truly, she really, really wanted to do well and she cared deeply about school. And that compounding guilt of not being true to herself put her in this negative cycle of guilt on guilt. And this is something I relate to so deeply, not because my family deprived me of anything essential or abused me, but because of that constant feeling of responsibility for your family, both my family of origin and the family that I've created. That keeps me in this cycle of guilt, which doing things for my family feels noble, feels right, versus doing things for myself feels isolating and selfish. The second theory is from Hoffman, another psychologist, that guilt may develop very early as a result of a child's emotional arousal and sensitivity to others' distress. The emphasis here is not the defensive dynamics, but rather on empathetic concerns for others. In House of Sticks, the turtle is a symbol of hope and spirituality. Its origins is from the story that Tran's dad shared with his kids about his time in the re-education camp, which he didn't have a lot of stories about, but this was the one story that he would tell them. He explains that he saved the turtle from being killed by a neighboring inmate, and later that day, him and his buddies found a way to escape the camp. The story goes, "We ran the whole night long," my father continues. "We ran until our lungs nearly gave out. But it didn't matter because in those moments, we tasted freedom for the first time in years. After years in shackles, nothing felt better than being able to move, to walk, to not sleep in our own piss. But the feeling didn't last long. We couldn't see where we were going in the dark, and we had no plan. We were also too weak to make it very far. They hadn't fed us in weeks. We were thin as toothpicks." This passage shows the inhumane conditions her dad endured in that education camp. The story continues, and we find out that him and his buddies were caught, and the officers tied each and every one of them to a post and shot at them. He went on to say that he could hear the shots and the thud of dead bodies nearby. And as they were approaching him, a higher up official arrived on the scene. This official told the other guys to stop what they were doing and release the prisoners because they had no authority to start killing people without. So Tran's dad was spared that day. He didn't die with his buddies. And he believed that it was good karma because he saved the turtle. And then the turtle, in turn, saved him. This story was told to Tran at a very young age and throughout her childhood and made her see and realize the conditions that her dad had lived through. Could her guilt have stemmed from knowing about her dad's hardships? Could my own guilt stem from knowing about my parents' hardships? Is it empathy? I don't know, but this deep dive rabbit hole actually led me to more questions than answers, to be honest. But it was a deep reflective exercise anyway, something that is necessary for anyone who wants to write a memoir. The third theory is that guilt is primarily cognitively based and not actually present in early development. Guilty feelings are triggered by perceived violations of one's own personal standard of conduct. This is actually a collection of theories where a person feels guilt on the basis of their own standards. For example, we feel good about being helpful, being considerate, being moral. So for this theory, a person has already developed a good sense of right and wrong. I imagine it to be like if you were taught that stealing was not a bad behavior, then you wouldn't feel guilt when you stole something from someone, because based on your own personal standard of conduct, it's not bad. Similarly, if you were taught to be a dutiful daughter all your life, to put the need of your family above your own, and suddenly you indulge in activities that are just for yourself, maybe it's as simple as relaxing on the couch, or reading a romance novel to yourself, or having a girls' night out. You feel guilt because it's wrong by your own standard. I also suffer from this, which makes me really prone to burnout. And I'm really working hard to undo these beliefs for myself and for my own well being. And that is the purpose of this exercise. If you're still here, I want to apologize that I've taken you down this deep rabbit hole with me. So, like I said, this memoir really resonated with me, and that's why this video is so long. And I went through multiple resources just to be able to process it. And if you felt the same way reading this memoir or any other memoir for that matter, please let me know in the comments so that I don't feel like I'm the only crazy person. I really hope that the author of this memoir has had time and space to work through these things for herself as well. And Jaylee, if you ever watch this video, can we go for coffee? I want to hang out with you and invite Joseph too. I love Joseph so much. You don't know me, but thank you, Joseph, for being the light in Jaylee's life and for all the teachers and counselors who cared so deeply for her when you really didn't have to. You guys went above and beyond. I don't know any of you, but I commend you all. Seeing so many good and noble people in her story was very inspiring. Okay, so that was so heavy. Let's just take a deep breath to help process all of that. Okay. I think the fact that Tran's writing could elicit such a reaction for me speaks to her writing ability and craft. And the fact that I spent so many hours looking inward at myself shows how powerful her memoir truly is. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about some of the more technical parts of craft that I found interesting to learn more about. If you didn't already know, I am not a professional writer and I am analyzing all these memoirs actually to improve my own writing so that I could write my own memoir better. But these are just observations that I've had based on the level of skill that I have. So take it with a grain of salt. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. I watched an interview with the author after I finished reading her book because I'm just a creeper like that. I love to watch interviews of authors of a book that I really, really liked. It's just part of my nature. But in that interview, the interviewer was asking her about her 5-part story structure instead of using a 3-part story structure. And in hearing that, I went to the table of contents of this memoir, House of Sticks, and lo and behold, there is 5 parts. In the interview, she explained how she wanted to structure her book to the 5 steps of getting a manicure, which I thought was really cool and artistic. Something like remove polish, cut buffer, prep, polish, something like that. And that's how she originally had her book structured. But as she started writing more, that structure sort of suffocated her story. And so she just let it go altogether. Then she said she wrote it as a chronological narrative and it just naturally fit into 5 parts. And interestingly, in another interview, she said that she wrote her last chapter first. And then she went back and wrote the entire book leading up to that last chapter. I've linked the video to the interview in the description below for anyone who's interested in watching. Okay, so for my memoir, I had a 3-part structure. And if you watch my previous video, how I used AI in my writing process, then you will know that it was ChatGPT who created my outline for me. And it split it up into 3 parts. And so this is probably just the generic 3-part structure of a novel that it used to create this outline for me. But now that I am analyzing House of Sticks, I know I need to expand on my memoir. And so I have to go and look at these other structures to see what would be a better fit for my memoir. But I do have a very simple understanding of the 3-part structure from my grade 12 English class. It's fairly simple. Part 1, the beginning. Establish the protagonist's issue and the context that they're living in. Part 2, the middle. The protagonist is doing all the things to solve the problems that were established in part 1, up into the climax, which is the biggest obstacle that they have to overcome. And then part 3, the revelations. Hopefully, the protagonist will get what they want or has changed in some way because of all the things that they did in the middle. So my memoir was kind of structured in this sort of way. And actually, in scripting this video, I thought that Shakespeare had 3 parts, but actually Shakespeare has 5-part acts. So all of his plays have 5 parts because I also studied Shakespeare in grade 12 English. So I read a couple of craft books to try and answer the question, why would someone choose to have 5-part structure versus a 3-part structure? And those craft books didn't really answer my question. but I did get some interesting points from them anyway that I'll talk about after if you're interested. But to answer my question, why would someone want to write a story with a 3-part structure versus 5-part structure? I needed a specific answer, so I just Googled it. I've linked the article that I used below in the description. The article has a really nice table comparing the 3-part structure versus the 5-part structure. So, according to this article, the 3-part structure are for stories that value efficiency. It's for stories that are straightforward, that need to move at a steady pace. The 3-part structure can be divided into setup, confrontation, and resolution. The 5-part structure offers a more gradual approach, offering room for more detailed storytelling and exploring outcomes in greater depth, like a layered development. And the parts of a 5-part structure are exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and conclusion. So, with House of Sticks being a 5-part structure, it actually totally makes sense to me because her story is so layered, so detailed, and to squeeze it into a 3-part action only memoir would have not made sense for the context of what she was writing about and how layered and complicated her situation was. I think when I go back to my memoir and make the revisions, I'll have to relook at the structure and see if something else will fit better. But to be honest, the 3-part versus 5-part structure, it kind of intrigued me. I was hoping actually for something more revolutionary, but it's still too planny, outliney for me, which I really don't like. So some of the things that I learned from the other craft books that have nothing to do with this 3-part, 5-part story structure was actually more helpful. John Trudy in The Anatomy of Story actually defined structure in a way that was easier to conceptualize in story writing. Is that structure is how a story develops over time based on human action. Here's a direct blurb from his book. Desire in all of its facets is what makes the world go around. It is what propels all conscious living things and gives them direction. A story tracks what a person wants, what he'll do to get it, and what costs he'll have to pay along the way. So he also breaks it down into 7 steps. Number 1, weakness and need. 2, desire. 3, opponent. 4, plan. 5, battle. 6, self-revelation. And 7, new equilibrium. Interestingly, these 7 points of structure that he kind of pointed out almost feels like a character thing, not a plot thing. So it kind of just goes to show that the development of your character, the story from your character's point of view, is actually more important than all the action and things that happen to your character. John Trudy in The Anatomy of Story also described the story body in a anatomy kind of way, which I really liked. Trudy describes the story body as the moral argument of the story is the brain of the story. The character is the heart and circulatory system. Revelations are the nervous system. The story structure is the skeleton, and the scenes are the skin. I think the way that he frames what story structure is and how the body of a story is the sum of its parts really actually help with story writing more than the arbitrary three act 5-act structure. Because even in Tran's interview, when they were asking her about writing House of Sticks, she did start off with a story structure and then decided to scrap it midway through, and then she just wrote her book in chronological order, and then the structure just naturally fit afterward. I also went through the craft book Story by Robert McKee, and he defines structure as a selection of events from the characters' life stories that is composed in a strategic sequence. Keyword, composed into a strategic sequence. So, when writing a memoir, obviously everyone has an entire life from birth to present, but you don't put in everything. That is an autobiography. But for a memoir, you need to strategically choose the life events that fit the story that you're trying to tell. He even goes further that these composed sequence of events need to arouse specific emotions and to express a specific view of life. So, for memoir, or I guess for any story for that matter, it's super important to make the reader feel something. something that Ly Tran did really well, at least with me. So Robert McKee also defines an event as characters, action or strife, mood, images, dialogue, versus a story event creates a meaningful change in the life situation of a character that is expressed and experienced in terms of value. And I think what Robert McKee was getting at here is that any event that you put into a story needs to have some significance that induces change in that character's life. And it has to be expressed in a way that is both valuable to that character, but also valuable to the reader who is reading the story, I think. I'm going to take a sip of my coffee. I apologize. I'm not fancy. I just drink black iced coffee. I used to drink iced coffee with condensed milk, but condensed milk has too much sugar. So I just drink black coffee with ice. So to conclude my video, House of Six by Ly Tran. If you haven't read it, please read it. It's really good. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're still watching, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I hope that I was able to provide some kind of value to you today. And if you're interested in following my writing journey, please subscribe and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.